Welcome to chapter 22, as we shift gears now and we focus on evolution, which we've always been talking about, but we're going to really look at it more closely. This first podcast is going to focus a little bit on Darwin, his initial ideas, and how he came to his beautiful idea of descent with modification, or what you guys commonly think of as evolution via natural selection. So this was his great achievement. This was his great understanding. And it wasn't like he worked with nothing, though. This is something where he took a bunch of works of other people as well as his own, and then was able to synthesize this new, elegant way of explaining what we see in the fossil record and what we see now today in additional evidences like DNA. So this was his Athena, if you will, his mind baby. So Darwin was a pretty cool guy, and he came up with this idea by going on a journey. And so on this journey, he looked at all this data, he read all these people's works, and he was able to address the fact that we knew at this point there was change over time. But the problem was, while people could see change over time in the fossil record, they could see that we could change things through artificial selection, where people have been breeding crops and livestock to produce more fruits or to be fatter or produce more milk. Dog breeds, I should say, were becoming more popular, and people were selectively breeding them to get what they wanted. So people knew that you could change stuff over time. The problem was no one knew how this worked. No one could explain the mechanism for how things were able to change over time. And so this is where Darwin stepped in with the idea of natural selection, which was that ultimately in nature, some organisms will be better at surviving and reproducing than others. And because they're better at surviving and reproducing, these organisms are ultimately able to pass on their genes more than other individuals. So their genes become more popular. The idea here is we'll call these things that make an organism better suited to survive in its environment, we'll call these adaptations. So if you see someone talking about adapting, or I've got this adaptation, it's really something that's meant to make you better able to function in your environment as you are. Now, these are not things animals think about. This is not things animals choose. You don't jump off the cliff and grow wings. You're not going to sit through and think about this and say, you know what'd be useful? A really big claw. These are things that you're either born with or you're out of luck. So don't sit here and think that evolution occurs over the span of like your lifespan, where you can alter your stuff and be all like Wolverine and you're good. No, you're just going to look like an idiot and you'll die anyway. The basic issue is this is where some individuals are born with different traits. They're born with these new mutations, and those are the adaptations that can then become more common if they're useful. So don't think that you're going to get any better than what you are. Unfortunately, you already have the cards that you have. So before writing his book, which he did in 1858, decades before that actually, he went on this voyage on the HMS Beagle. And so the HMS Beagle cruised around for years and hit many, many different places. So you can see here that as they went through, they hit several places in South America, the Galapagos Islands. They then went over and hit several places in and around Australia, one place in Africa, just a little bit there. So on their way, I guess one place further up, Cape Verde, but they, for the most part, hit a variety of places along coastlines, in South America especially, but Australia and Africa to some extent. And each time he stopped, he'd tend to draw pictures of wildlife. He would take samples of wildlife, many of them just preserved, some of them sketches. He'd collect fossils. Basically, any evidence he could find of what was living there, he'd collect, and then they'd continue on. And so once he got back, he had all this stuff he'd collected over years of out there voyaging in the HMS Beagle, and he pretty much sat there and processed the stuff for decades. He didn't just write this book out of nowhere. When he was writing his book on the origin of species, ultimately via natural selection, he was going through and carefully sifting through all the things that he'd found, trying to understand why things might change. And so these are kind of what he was working on. These are the things he observed and what was in his mind when he did this. The first was exponential fertility. Things have a lot of babies, far more than what they need. A rabbit might have a litter of 6 and it might do this, 8 times a year. If you're doing that, that's a ton of rabbits. If a rabbit can live, which it can in captivity at least, up to like a decade, holy crap, you need to have like 2 rabbits to replace yourself over the course of a decade. You're talking about, depending on the litter size, you're talking about probably 50 to 100 bunnies that you can produce each year, depending on the rabbit. That's way overkill. And so other people had pointed this out. He used stuff like Thomas Malthus was another writer. So don't assume Darwin came up with all these on his own. But there's exponential fertility was noted. So he's thinking, all right, too many babies. But even despite all these babies, they noticed that the population size of most organisms tended to stay about the same. So if there was, 20, we'll say squirrels. So if there's 20 squirrels living in your neighborhood, you're probably going to have around 20 squirrels, maybe 18, maybe 24 for a while, but around 20 squirrels indefinitely. So this didn't jive with like babies coming out your ears. And then they noticed there's limited resources. There's only so much food. We can have this with humans where we can figure out we're running out of food. We all need to eat. There's only so much stuff that's out there that we can eat. And so sooner or later, if we have too many people and not enough food, we got a problem. It could also be shelter. It could also be water. So limited resources is just the idea that something that we need will run out if we have too many people, if we have a lot of people, if we have this exponential fertility. And then individuals vary. They could look at different individuals of any species and they would notice that they weren't all the exact same color or size. Or if it's a bird, maybe its beak's a bit different or its claws. If you're talking about a mammal, you might have different texture of the hair. You might have different snout length. There's differences that we're able to see amongst any group, population, species that we come across. And lastly, due to artificial selection largely, they were able to know that somehow it seemed as though the children tended to be like the parent. They didn't know genetics, so they wasn't sure exactly how, but they knew that it appeared that individuals with a trait could pass it on to their offspring. They didn't know the odds or any of that stuff, but there does appear this idea that if you breed small dogs, you tend to get smaller pups. And they grow into smaller dogs, which you can then breed the smallest of those dogs and keep making them smaller and smaller until they become utterly worthless. And so that's this idea of heritable variation, is that not only are you stuck with the hand that you're dealt genetically, and you can't kind of improve upon it during your life, but you also, if you're able to reproduce, survive that long, impress somebody enough, if you're able to, you're likely to pass that on to your children. So if it's a really good trait, they can get your good trait. If it's a really bad trait, they can get your bad trait. And so this gave us a vehicle to kind of work vertically over generations, even though he didn't know the exact details. This is one of those that they had some evidence with artificial selection, but it wasn't perfect. And so using that, he came up with 3 inferences. He said, all right, what can I draw? What conclusions can I make from this? The first is there's a struggle for existence. This is pretty straightforward. Limited resources, a ton of babies, stable population size. If all those babies were doing pretty good, we would have the population size skyrocketing. And even if the population size does skyrocket, that's just going to make us hit a resource wall where there's not enough of something, and so there's going to be competition and people will die off. Or animals, whatever it is we're talking about. So there does appear to be the struggle for existence that not all the children will survive. Many of them won't. So that gets to be this idea then, well, which ones don't survive? And so he was able to figure out it's non-random survival. So that means certain individuals, like if you're the albino squirrel, you will tend to have a much lower chance of surviving. If you have what is the quote-unquote bad trait right now, that makes you more likely to die and not pass on that trait to the next generation. So it appears as though some people that were born with certain traits were able to do better just because they were born with the proper traits. So of these people that died off during this struggle, it might be that individuals that were the biggest or the smallest or a specific color, they don't do most of the dying off. It's somebody else who maybe is, too small so predators get it, or too big so it can't hide. They did most of the dying off. So non-random survival. And then 3, natural selection, which really what I'm going to put this one down to is the idea that differential reproduction. So with natural selection, you're going to see that of the ones that do survive, that's part of differential reproduction. If I'm dead, it's really hard to reproduce with that individual. Please don't try that at home. But if you go through and you look at this, of the individuals that even made it to reproductive age, we've already eliminated a bunch from breeding. Of those, only certain ones tended to be favored. So oftentimes you could have where one male reproduces a ton, we'll say me in this scenario, and another male, use Mr. Kaufman as an example, would not reproduce at all or very little. And so if you look at that type of scenario, you can see that some individuals will do a much better job of passing on their traits than others. Some individuals, just because they survive, that wasn't enough. If the ladies don't like them, or if they're sickly to where they're alive, but they can't really focus on reproduction, if you really don't feel well, I doubt that you're normally thinking like booty call. And so for animals, you get the same kind of scenario where if you're hungry all the time and you're barely getting by, you're probably not going to reproduce that much versus an animal that's well fed, and so it's sitting around kind of bored thinking, hey, what would be fun? And there we go. And so natural selection will just be this differential, and you'll see me use that differential word a lot, differential reproductive. And a lot of times they'll say reproductive success because it's not just about having babies. You'll see too when we talk about reproductive success, we oftentimes will look at how good do your babies do. Because this is one of the reasons that as like a female, if you can choose amongst males, there are benefits to picking the best male because they're going to give you the genes that will help your offspring survive better. So the good male might allow you to have a 50% success rate at your offspring making it to adulthood themselves versus a not so good male might be something more like 1%, 5%, 10%, something that's markedly less. And so as a female, you're putting a lot of time, energy, and risk into raising these chillins, which ultimately are probably not going to make it to adulthood. So you're largely wasting your time. And so it makes sense, even if they don't think it through, the ones that do make the right decision, their babies live, and they tend to continue doing what that individual did. The ones that maybe like the sickly guys, their children, which might like sickly guys too, tend to die off, so there's not many of them. So that's the idea where nature's taking care of this. This is not random though. A lot of people act like evolution is random. Some aspects are, like mutation, but natural selection is not a random process. This is something where the environment, and I hate to anthropomorphize, but it's kind of choosing, just based upon conditions, who lives and who dies. It's not thinking it through, but if you're neon pink, you're not going to be very good if you live around hawks and you're hawk-sized to be eaten. If you're a little bunny or mouse, it's a bad situation. And so you will be killed more frequently, and it's not like nature has it in for you. You just are not, I don't want to say built, but not properly set genetically to thrive in that environment. And so you will non-randomly be taken out. Okay, I'm going to pick up with evidences next, so I'm going to stop here for today.